Welcome back to Side Quests, and truly, there have been some side quests between our iterations of Side Quests here with Mr. Wesley Schantz, who is back with me, and me, Mr. Alexander Schmidt. And there, some time has passed, and during that time, what have you been up to, Wes? What sorts of side quests have you been getting into professionally, personally, philosophically? It's good to talk to you again. I'm glad that we're doing this.
Yeah, me too. It's been too long. I've been playing Xenogears a lot. I was reading some stuff related to that recently, and I um, have had a new addition to the family. My wife had her first kid, and he's
Congratulations.
2 months today, 2 months old today, and doing great. Yeah, and um, I'm, looking forward to playing video games with him someday, but for now he's excited just to like walk around and look at stuff and see what he can grab and stick in his little tiny mouth and all that good stuff. So uh
Yeah.
he he is he's upstairs, but we might hear him. He might make an appearance here. He did the other night when I was talking about Final Fantasy with Ben. That's what we've been playing also, is Final Fantasy 6. So we have been busy. Yeah.
Yeah. So what sorts of projects have you been doing? I think I recall that you did and have finished the Golden Compass. You finished up the Zelda with Ben. And you've also done Xenogears and gone through that now or are preparing to. Yeah. Can you just sort of outline what you've been doing?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I've been doing my own podcast, and that was started with Earthbound and then Golden Compass, and then I jumped into both the sequel, The Subtle Knife, and Xenogears kind of at the same time, and have been doing them concurrently instead of sequentially. And
Hmm.
so Xenogears is about done, and Subtle Knife is done, and I'm into the third book now, the Amber Spyglass, and it's a bigger one. So I've been kind of like tackling a bunch of chapters at a time. So generally, I just sort of like I've seen the snowball effect kind of go on in all sorts of ways. And yeah, doing the Xenogears, I've talked to a few different people. Would love to have you on that show at some point to talk about some of the literary and psychological and even religious aspects of the game that I think you could speak to real well. And when I finish that, I don't know. I mean, again, working on Final Fantasy with Ben and kind of hoping to make that into a kind of academia related website. There's a site for academics, but we would like to make one that's sort of specific to game studies. And there are, like, a number of scholars working in that field already, but hoping to make their work a little bit more accessible to lay people like ourselves. So that's kind of the thought about that project at this point. So a lot of different little hobbies going on here.
Okay, and I know that you've said that your favorite sort of young adult fantasy literature growing up was not Harry Potter, but was Golden Compass.
Oh yeah.
And your favorite game was not Xenogears nor Final Fantasy, but was what you originally played, Earthbound.
Yeah.
Where does this game fit in for you? This Chrono Trigger game, again, another game that I never played as a young video game player.
Oh man, yeah, Chrono Trigger was right around that same time. I believe it came out the same year as Earthbound even. And I loved it.
1995.
Yeah, I always loved it. I think it's a, top five game for me probably. I replay it from time to time. I think of it fondly, and I think my favorite thing about the game, which makes it maybe stand out above just about any other, Earthbound accepted, of course, is the music. I love the music for this game. The kind of atmosphere that it creates and the kind of place it puts you in when you hear it is really really wonderful. So I think that it accomplishes, what any great work of art does, which is it sort of teaches you a new way to look at the world. And in this game, if you haven't got too far into it yet, I won't spoil it, but it's a time travel game. You probably have figured that much out by now. And the kind of things that you are able to observe about the world when you see it sort of go through this long stretch of time, um, and meet people from different eras, and it's just a really really cool experience. So I'm looking forward to getting to discuss it with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. And I did want to ask a little bit about that conceit. Well, I suppose two things. One thing that you expressed an interest in for this project is not just meeting the game without an intermediary, but also considering some of the scholars and the scholarship that are relevant to the game. And you sent
Definitely.
me an online book, which is at thegamedesignforum.com. And I've been reading a little bit up on this game and on the two stories, the comedy and the tragic aspect of it, that are interwoven in some way or another. And I am looking forward to looking out for those aspects. So apparently this game is a tragedy and a comedy, but not a tragic comedy. And I also recently, just before this, for the second time, listened to one of Resonant Arc's analyses of Chrono Trigger. And it's interesting because he said that he didn't want to describe his perception of the music in platitudes, but would have to, because music for him is essentially a metaphysical experience, as opposed to, and that he approaches music for its beauty rather than in an analytical mode as he approaches his decision making. And so it was very interesting that you talked about the music in this particular game, especially because it comes not only some of the late material in the game comes from Hironobu, I'm forgetting his last name. I think it's Sakaguchi, the great, Nobuo Uematsu,
Right.
who is the music designer for the Final Fantasy games, many of the like 6, 7, 8, I think 9 too, and also a young sound engineer who made a vast majority of the game's music, just because he needed an opportunity to make more money. And so it is interesting that you have a great who helped to design some of the music for this game, as well as somebody who really had to make it. And a point that I think it was Mike Brown, that Resonant Arc has a couple of guys that work there or work on their materials. He said that he can really feel that passion in the music.
Oh yeah.
And even in the original title screen song, which is itself called Chrono Trigger. He says he can feel that. And I don't know, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what the music does for you in this game, what the importance of music is to this medium now that you've been, really focusing on it for well over a year. You've been playing these games for so long, but you've been essentially a scholar of those games for over a year now. And, maybe make some particular comments on Chrono Trigger itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and those are great comments. I'm not as familiar with the Resonant Arc work on this game. I know that they have a piece on Xenogears, which is really good. So they have good taste. I can say that for them. And I'll have to check that one out. But I like that way of talking about the effect of the music as a kind of whole or integral experience and not an analytical one. I mean, I think I approach it in a similar way because I just don't know enough about the music analysis that might help you dig into it in that way. But
Sure.
what it does, what it does accomplish, the music is a kind of time travel device, right? Like for someone who plays this game as a kid, it imprints on you in such a way that whenever you hear some of those themes, it takes you back to a different time and a different place. It immerses you, I think, in a certain atmosphere, which is, a kind of tranquil one in some places in the game, and a very frenetic and crazy one in other parts of the game. Its job is to make you feel like you are, engaged in something that matters. And the music, I think, has elements that really stand up on their own as well. So if you take them out of the context of the game, they're still great. You could perform these songs, and I think they have been performed with great effect. But as they're part of the game, they contribute to the kind of story that it's telling. And as you say, this other scholar, I think his name is Patrick Holloman. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but the Game Design Forum writer, anyhow, has this theory about the two games, the tragedy of the entity, the comedy of the sages, and the ways in which music is able to accomplish that movement, right, between levels of emotion, I think is really unparalleled. It's so immediate. It's so there's no defense against it, right? You can't not feel when the music is moving you in that way. And so, I mean, I think that's, again, for me, the primary thing that I think about with this game is the effectiveness of the sound design and those kind of collaborative efforts between those two composers. Yeah, Uematsu, who is famous for the Final Fantasy series, and Yasunori Mitsuda is the main composer and the one who really made his name with this game, and did the sequel as well, and the Xenogears music. So that's kind of where he takes his point of departure here. And so yeah, there's a lot of very interesting stories, both within the game and then in the context of its creation, that the music is a way into.
And so just to sort of jump around a little bit, because we're just now dipping our feet right back into the water. And speaking of immersion, it's not always you don't always wet each body part at the same rate. And so I just sort of, something that, just to build on something we talked about in Final Fantasy. So part of the reason that I wanted to go through that entire series with you, which we did effectively, and I'm very proud and very happy to have done with you, was to see how it stood up to scrutiny over time. And a claim that Resonant Art has made that I of course agree with is that we sort of grew up, you and I, where I'm 34 now, I think you're 32. Mm-hmm. We grew up and we played similar games growing up. I probably played a little, slightly fewer because I was later to the video game. I was later to the video game due mostly to my parents getting me there about a year later than most people. When the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo first came out, a lot of people got those for Christmas, and I got them the next Christmas. So I was sort of behind the learning curve. And it took me even longer to get into RPGs. I didn't play my first RPG until actually the next generation on PS1. My first real RPG was Final Fantasy VII alongside Final Fantasy VIII. So I was a bit of a neophyte. But one of the conceits that we talked about was, do these games stand up to scrutiny over time? And my conclusion, my personal conclusion, not necessarily yours, was that no, in that Final Fantasy is obviously not, for me, as sophisticated as a piece of epic literature along the lines of, say, Milton or Dante. But you had made a point to me that, well, that's not necessarily what they're attempting to do. They are, by definition, and I think this could be argued these days, especially with us having grown up in the golden age and still continuing to play video games, they are made for young adults. And so they are more entryways into the great works. They produce the first, or they represent in their own way great political themes, great psychological themes, great themes about friendship and loyalty and betrayal and mortality, and often direct one, including you and me, to these greater sources or to these other older sources, where you can, say, more directly look for, say, like Christian religious themes. You might then read the Bible, or St. Augustine or St. Aquinas or somebody like that. Or if you get really into Gnosticism, you can go to a Gnostic text after playing Xenogears. And so just to get back into my habit of asking you extremely long-winded, high German-sounding questions, Wes, it's just, if the conceit of this game is Chrono Trigger, that we jump through time and you get to see the development of things throughout time, and you see the development of Chrono's world over time, is that supposed to itself be a representative of, say, a liberal education that also is supposed to change and enhance your perspective by enabling you to see the future through the past, potentially? And B, what is it like now to be jumping into the past and this is why I thought of this, by hearing the music of Chrono Trigger, by talking about it and representing it in the theater of your imagination? What is that like? Does it stand up to scrutiny now? And do you still agree that a game like this is supposed to be sort of a segue into deeper studies, or do you potentially have a stronger disagreement with my former point, which is that actually this sort of game, with its its musical score and so much being put into it, is its own medium that deserves to be considered the same level as something like an epic poem or like a masterpiece of music like an opera?
I mean, I have a more of a pedagogical approach to these games, I'd say, and yeah, there's sort of an archway through which you can glimpse these other works, which are objectively perhaps greater and certainly have had a greater influence on uh, the culture, everything basically, right? Because they've been here for much longer. I don't know to what extent these games will continue to impact people unless there's a kind of scholarly, or pedagogical force sort of sending people back to them. I think that people are most likely gonna sort of find out about the kinds of things that they're most interested in one way or the other. And I think that, video games are an effective way to direct people towards great books. I'm just kind of interested in seeing whether there's something that directs people towards great video games at this point, and I want to sort of contribute to that. I think that, when you come to a game at the right age, it does have that kind of powerful impact on you in much the way that a great book would. And maybe at that age, you're not really ready for the great book yet. And so this is really the appropriate thing to experience and get that kind of taste for something which you can only really dig into a little bit later on. And I think that that's kind of, it's interesting to what extent that process can be at all curated, and to what extent it has to sort of be just coincidental, or maybe the better word, right? The Jungians would say that that's a synchronicity or something of that sort, right? But I guess to the question about, what kind of experience this is within the game, whether it's a kind of liberal education or, representation of something like that. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing better than traveling, immersing yourself in different places or, time periods, so to speak, and experiencing things firsthand. That's really, what it's all about. You can't just like hear a lot of lectures about a great book. You've got to actually read the book, and you can't just, learn a language and never use it. You've got to go and speak it with somebody who speaks it as their native language to really know it, to really see the world through that new lens, I think.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily trying to impugn the game at all, or to denigrate it. It strikes me that it does remind me a lot of something like, say, a Wrinkle in Time. Again, one of those books that I do think has seminal value when you come back to it at any age, especially even as just a watermark for your personality and your own personal development. And so something you said was very interesting to me. And obviously I'm over the next few years going to, I have a very specific project that I'm working on. I'm not trying to be cryptic about it, but we can talk about that when we want to. But it looks like the project that's developing for you, and perhaps I'm just slow to the game because I know that you've actually literally said this sort of thing before, it seems like you are trying to preserve, create a body of literature and of audio on these works that you spent so much time on as a young person that are perhaps great in their own way, and perhaps are all the greater for the imprinting effect they have, to use a neuroscience term, on us at the time that we listen to them, in that sort of golden window of like developing our character in order to pursue the noble and the good. Obviously, reading Aristotle at that time would be like great, but probably not nearly as interesting as getting to fight monsters while we do it. But my question is this: if you are willing to devote this sort of time and energy to this, Wes, and this does seem to be, your vocation, even more than your sort of on paper profession at this point, is what is it in these games, and in this game specifically, that recommends itself to the future, that you think is worth preserving. And even makes it worth me spending, over a day in terms of hours playing it. Because I mean, obviously you do think that there is something of great worth, and probably many things of great worth in there. And I just, since we're at the beginning, and you've played it and I haven't, would love to hear what you think on that.
Oh, totally, yeah. Well, I think it's gonna be something different for each person, what they might take from this game. Um, I have a great love of these games, and I just kind of want to see if I can share that with people, and if by doing so they might take something useful from it. That's really what it comes down to. And that's true of the Golden Compass, those books, and that's true of these video games. Like I say, I don't think that they yet have that status to where they're necessarily going to survive unless there's people out there who are passionate about them, and are kind of running up to people and saying, hey, look at this thing, which is so interesting. What do you think of it? Or by doing that, finding one another, other people who have similar interests, and getting to talk about that thing together and delve into it. And so, yeah, I think we're at sort of the beginning of the study of games, video games, that is. And it's just exciting. It's like really enjoyable. It is a thing that I just like to do. Whether I ever get to make a living at it or not, I think I'll still just do it as a hobby indefinitely at this point. But I think, to be a little more concrete about it, this particular game in Chrono Trigger, you have a very kind of classic JRPG. So you can learn a lot about a particular medium, which is very, I think, influential in video games in general. And I think that you have a really, a really experientially interesting bit of storytelling, because the kind of text that you get in this game is kind of limited, and yet they get to create a pretty complex and interesting story using not that much actual dialogue, really, compared to a game like Final Fantasy, or even more so even Xenogears, which is super text heavy. Really, a different world, actually, even though it's just been a few years between the two games, in terms of what they're able to do. But in this game, yeah, in particular, I think that you're sort of brought into a world and invited to explore it, and invited to think about the kinds of ways that doing that is going to save this world. And that's kind of my big thing about Earthbound as well, is what saving the world looks like in that game, what it entails. And I think something kind of similar, but with that very different mechanic of the time travel, is definitely at play here in Chrono Trigger too.
Okay, and there's another question that I have for you, and it's so interesting to what extent scholarship can, and just instruction on a primary source can help you to see what is actually there. I think a criticism sometimes of secondary literature is that it is not a substitute for primary literature, but I don't know that anybody would ever admit that they thought that was true.
Right.
But something about reading this first chapter on the tragedy of the entity and the comedy of the sages was talking about a point that was made, is that this game often does things in a way that other RPGs traditionally do, but also is very good at subtly undermining such conventions and doing things differently without you even noticing it. So, and that actually the creator takes great sort of joy in doing that sort of thing, in undermining your expectations. And I thought that was so interesting, because in the first quest, when you're Chrono and you have this inventor friend, Luca, who's sort of like crazy. She's sort of like Maurice plus Belle from Beauty and the Beast, and is about to go to this world fair, and her items apparently never work out as she intends for them to. But and you meet this girl, I think it's Marley, and she seems something interesting seems to be up with her, and there might be a romantic element there, but she gets sent into the past, and you get sent into the past, and Then there's a crisis of identity with this first princess. This princess is gone, but then Marley is there, and she looks just like her. Then you have to go through a cathedral dungeon, and it's interesting that religion is immediately shown there. Apparently, this is like sort of a Christian Middle Age, very sort of typical seeming story, even to the point that you have somebody who has literally been turned into a frog, sort of like the princess in The Frog, who is a knight and speaks in like poorly translated would be early modern like Shakespearean English, saying things like, and Resonant Art brought my attention to this, like we'll say like will to ye rather than like will thou, as it actually should have been. But I wanted to ask you about that element of storytelling, because I know that that's also a part of the Earthbound series, that actually the creator had literally said that he wanted to betray the players. So to what extent, even though this game seems sort of plain in terms of JRPGs at first, is that simply a convention that is supposed to sort of put me to sleep, so that when it wakes me up with the big twists, they really get me? Or is it more the case that this game is just so nuanced and subtle that you really have to pay attention in order to even see those elements?
Well, I think that the argument that Reverse Design Forum is making there is kind of a subtle one. I think it will probably hold up. There's a lot of evidence to back it up. But I don't think that's the only way to interpret it. Yeah, I mean, as a kid playing this game, you're not going to pick up on all that stuff. This is all very much in hindsight. And so for you, playing the game for the first time, I think that you're going to pick up on a lot of sort of those kind of elements that you're harping on there, right? With the inventor friend, the princess, the frog, these kinds of things that have a kind of powerful attraction to one with any sort of storytelling or mythological interest at all, right? There's of course people play the game just to run around, find treasures, fight monsters, and that's totally fine too, right? Like, this game is beautifully designed to let you do that without a second thought, and that's fine. That's a totally valid way to play the game too. So like I said, different people are going to take different things from it, but yeah, with the benefit of hindsight and a certain amount of kind of literary language at your disposal, yeah, it's very interesting to see the kinds of deceptions, I guess you could call it, or invitations that the game offers, and then the ways in which it departs from your expectations. And I mean, for me, I think that the kind of classic storytelling components are just as interesting, really. I mean, and I don't mind Frog's kind of stilted language at all. I think it's a really nice touch to give each of the characters a kind of unique speech quality or dialect that makes them really recognizable and identifies them with their time period. So as you go through, each of your party members is kind of from a different time period and has a different way of speaking as a result. But yeah, anyway, yeah, I think that the confusing part for me is kind of what is Chrono about, because he doesn't really speak at all. And he in that way is the classic RPG stock hero figure who you can sort of make what you will of as the player controlling him. So that's the part that I'm going to really kind of try to dig into this time through the game, is what to do with that silent protagonist in such a world.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that too, and how he is similar to, say, like a Link from Zelda in that respect. And I'll send you the Resonant Arc link, but that was actually a bitter debate in the game's design, whether to have a silent protagonist or not. And one of I remember the guy's first name, Nori, but I don't recall his last name. He was of the perspective that when a protagonist speaks, that breaks the connection between player and protagonist, because the player had otherwise or erstwhile been believing that they were, in fact, the character, and that they were at one in as many ways as possible. But when the character gives voice to a differing perspective, that breaks that connection. And, Resident Arc had made the point that he said that he thought that worked in certain cases with, like, say, Link, and in games other games where you totally customize your character, like Elder Scrolls Morrowind, where you change their class, their appearance, their name, their race, their ability set, all of that. That makes sense. But at other times, it's useful to have a protagonist that speaks. So I guess I do want to ask you about that. Well, do you like that Chrono is a silent protagonist, just since we're asking about structuring? To that question, the other question I really wanted to ask you is, since the game is translated from Japanese originally, should we consider ourselves as not seeing the original in terms of, should we consider what we are playing / reading, if we consider our playing of the game reading of a text, like the postmodernists, which perhaps we are in some way or another. Are we playing in translation? Is there something lost?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it's important to keep that in mind, as long as you're not playing naively, right? That you are getting this at second hand in some ways. You're not necessarily getting everything as it was intended in the original version. But at the same time, that just sort of adds another layer of the kind of interpretive work that's available to you, which I find really interesting because it's a matter of decision making. And even the name of these three sages, when you meet them, their names are an interesting kind of departure that the translator or localizer chose to make, which has actually been pretty famous, I think influential actually. And so there's an element of, like, there's just more to talk about as a result, whereas if you had the original Japanese dialogue, there wouldn't be that aspect to talk about. And I think for me, playing these games, one big part of it was that sense of this other culture that the game had come out of, and the ways in which it did and did not line up with, the kind of society I was living in at the time in America, right? So the Japanese and the American sources and those kind of decisions that are made by the creators and translators are really, really interesting. And yet we can all sort of come together and experience this thing, because the world we live in now is totally connected in that way. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of it. The silent Chrono part, yeah, I love Chrono as a character. I think he's a wonderful, wonderfully designed, and he's designed by the Dragon Ball artist, I believe, did all the concept art for this game. So that's, I mean, pretty cool. That was kind of the anime that made anime a thing in the States, as far as I remember. And so, yeah, so he's a fascinating, I think, kind of idealization of what it's like to be a kid and get to go on an adventure. He has a sword. I mean, he's so cool. He's so freaking cool. I don't think I ever was confused that I was him, but I might have wanted to be his friend or something like that, right? And have that kind of strong, silent, quality. I certainly admired that about him.
He is a person of actions with that sword, and something again Resident Arc brings up is that the character design was very carefully done, and they chose to go with sort of a mix between Final Fantasy VII and it was either Dragon Quest or Legend of Mana, and but that it is its own definitive style, and even in the and they decided not to have random encounters, which I love, which I think Earthbound does as well. And when you do get into a battle, it doesn't change from the exploration screen and interrupt everything, which I also have to admit to loving. But it's just so interesting what you just said. In the same way that these JRPGs are an invitation to a culture that is alien to ours, if we as players are, say, Americans from the US like you and I, and the JRPG obviously comes from Japan, it is interesting to what extent the game presents itself as familiar. The characters sort of look Western westernized, except for in sort of odd ways too. Like Chrono's hair is a color of red that would never happen in reality, and I think Luca has green hair too, and like you can do that, but it looks very natural there. But something about their world, there are many aspects of it that seem homey, potentially because of the music, but are very different from ours. Like Chrono is obviously a child warrior. He has a sword and he can be killed. There's time travel. That's not something we normally experience. There are kings and queens in one of the eras that are gone to. And a talking frog who speaks a Middle Eastern dialect, or excuse me, a middle-aged dialect. He'd be a little bit different with the Middle Eastern one. It'd be harder to understand him for me, at least, no matter where. None of these elements, even though the game itself feels sort of familiar and at home, are really familiar elements. And I wonder to what extent that is a thematic or a storytelling device to show you that which you think is familiar is actually deeply unfamiliar. And that is what the process of learning really is about.
It's an interesting kind of storytelling device, to bring you into a world which looks familiar and looks similar to yours, and then to sort of jump into a totally different one, and so that you, with the characters, are feeling this kind of dislocation effect. And there's a really cool way in which this game addresses that topic later on. I guess it's sort of the breaking point between these two games, as Holloman describes them. There's this kind of interruption into the hitherto normal world in the present time period, which everyone suddenly, when you're there, they take it as completely normal, right? But for you who've seen that change take place, it's very ominous. It's very unexpected, and it's a really cool. I mean, I think it's something that these games were really beautifully placed to be able to do, because they're able to take and mix together a lot of different elements, right? Ones that are very familiar and ones that are completely made up, or allude to various different kinds of stories. You have your medieval, you have your futuristic, you can throw them all together and it's not a big problem. It just creates this new thing, which is really fun to explore.
Last question. To what extent are you the person that you thought you would become while you played Chrono Trigger at this point in your life? Because it's very important to me or it was important to me when I was young, and I've shared, I think on the air and certainly with you, that I always wanted to sort of not just always be in a mimetic state of imitating the heroes, or vicariously imitating the heroes that I wanted to be by simply embodying them in video games, but to try and embody the virtues that they embodied in their narratives in my own life, in my own narrative. And so it was always a big goal of mine as a young person to become the person I really wanted to become as an adult. And so my question, it's sort of a personal psychological question, is to what extent have you fulfilled the promise that young you embodying Chrono wished for you to embody? To what extent have you continued to hear the golden or the silver sleigh bell from Santa given in the Polar Express?
Right on. Yeah, no, I think this was the big theme really of our discussion of Final Fantasy VII, because the kind of identity and heroism themes in that game are so salient, really. I think I had a pretty vague notion of what I wanted to be like as a grown-up. I had a pretty limited sense of my own, self or potential or something. Like I was really happy doing all the things I got to do as a kid, and wasn't really in any particular hurry to have to go and get a job and be a real adult. but that's the way time goes, right? It flows in one direction. And I think over, the course of being in school and, making friends and going off to college, some of that stuff came into focus a little bit more. I had some really great educational opportunities and got to travel and, study in different places and see different cultures. And I think that was a really formative experience for me. But something that, from a young age, I had this kind of image of, even though I didn't really recognize it in these games, right? Of going and traveling the world. Like that is what you do in every RPG. And sure enough, that's what I ended up getting the chance to do. And so I've been, really grateful to have been able to do that and, come home and be able to make a new home for myself here. I think that's about all that I could ask for. Has been, um, in some small way, maybe due to some of the kind of unexpected education that I got from these video games growing up.
Yeah, well, that's very beautiful, and it is interesting that you tie that back to Final Fantasy VII and say that was the essence of our conversations, because I suppose we are, as Cloud is, in the moment that he experiences that psychic break, because he's been identifying with someone who he's not. And so in the same way, we identify with someone who we are not in a video game. And I think that is sort of the siren call of a video game, that it is a problem if you only identify with the character rather than attempting to, in your own reality, attempting to live your fullest life and to embody the things you wish to embody, whether they be virtues or otherwise. That's really cool to see that this sort of game had that sort of an effect on you, and that there are such a range of media these days that can have that sort of effect. Like, I mean, obviously I see great value in texts like the Old and the New Testament, and I see tremendous wisdom in them. And of course, ancient philosophy and tragedy. And, I teach ancient, medieval, and Renaissance literature and philosophy. I believe in these things very clearly, but that people do have such a range of media from which they can get such a range of valuable lessons that can be translated in so many different ways in this, this increasingly free and interesting world. I think is tremendously valuable. It's a very exciting time to be alive.
Oh yeah, no, I think these games make a really interesting lens because they are kind of the quintessential art form of our time, which is a time in which all these things are converging and becoming more and more available. And and you don't have to give up the old stuff in order to get the new stuff, which I think is that would be the hard choice for me. I don't know about you, but I'd have a hard time, saying I will never, play another game. I will just read ancient texts all day. I don't know. I like having both. I like be able to move between them. I'm traveling.
Yeah, precisely. Well, hopefully none of us have to ever make that sort of decision. Our families, as so long as our families continue to give us some leeway with our time. Wes, I've been doing my intermittent fasting thing all day, and it's the same time for me as it is for you, around 4 p.m. now. And it's about time for me to eat some non-manna, some non-ambrosia, some non-intellectual food. I've had quite the appetizer here talking to you, and it's been just like riding a bike, getting back to it, doing the podcasting, and with relatively little material to talk about too. So, I mean, I know that we had originally wanted to talk about Xenogears and Childhood's End, and I do still want to have a side quest and do that sort of thing. But I would also, having these discussions, these enlightening discussions, these seminar-like discussions, and these, in some ways, scholarly discussions, and that we, consider the work of other people as well. It gives me a lot of reason to play the video game, so that I don't just razz myself for, I've gone through some interesting thinking lately, thinking about first order and second order actions and the best activities that you can spend your limited time in a day playing, which is why I'm no longer on social media, because I'd rather be reading during that time. And those are the sorts of sort of hierarchical decisions you have to make, especially when your time starts to get more and more limited, as yours and mine now is. And so having more and more reasons stacked up to do a thing makes it less likely, or makes the thing different for me in of itself. It takes on a different value, a different valence, and becomes less like, oh, well, you're trying to relive the past and you're playing a hero that you're now older than, which is, a very nasty argument that one's subconscious can make, or, a friend of one's that doesn't understand the value of video games. But coming at it from a scholarly angle and doing it in order to promote the value in the game, in order to keep it alive and to contribute to an emerging body of literature, and to do that with a friend who truly loves it, those are many good reasons to do a thing that are hard to dismiss with a cutting and in many ways naive comment from my own subconscious.
Yeah. Just get your subconscious to play the game with you, and it'll come around, I'm sure.
I think it will. It's funny. I'm using that Freudian term. I'm such a Jungian. I should have said unconscious, but the Jungians would say personal unconscious. So you have to forgive my method, or excuse me, my particular diction, my syntax, terminology. There we go. That's what I'm looking for when I'm speaking on the fly. Obviously, right there, right? Well, Wes, this has been a very diverting side quest, and I'm looking forward to more side quests with you again. I suppose we should, if we were more high budget and we did effects, it would show us joining the same party again for a new voyage.
All right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. I'm glad you're playing Chrono Trigger for the first time. That's way cool. So stick with it. Don't let the bad voice make you go do work all the time.
I won't. And I do think that is a bad voice. And and perhaps the shadow mixed with the anima a little bit, to use some Jungian terms right there for those of you who like to read Jung and apply those thoughts to your lives. I'm really looking forward to it. And I like that it's streamlined. And I like that it doesn't waste one's time, really. One doesn't have to grind in order to level up in the game. I think it's going to be a great experience. And it's, again, an experience that I've been meaning to have that I haven't. And, I think it's always the present when you have to do that. That book you've been meaning to read, you got to sit down and read it now. That game you've been meaning to read, you have to sit down and read it now, because I've gotten used to meaning to play the game. And so I even will say things like, oh, I've been meaning to play that, but I'll say that 10,000 times and never play it.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to have the opportunity to actually check something off my list, rather than to repeat for the 10,000th time about the length of my list and how I've made no traction on it for some amount of time.
Yeah. Well, here we go.
Yeah, here we go. All right. Till next time.
Thanks again.
Thank you.